Now let's turn our attention to Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Wyoming Fair Employment Practices Act of 1965. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC. The EEOC is tasked with investigating possible violations of a person's civil rights, according to this act. Now, normally the EEOC would conduct investigations on allegations of discrimination under this act. However, there is an agreement between the Department of Workforce Services and the EEOC in investigation. What this does is avoid duplication of investigations. So this has been delegated to the State Department of Workforce Services. That way we don't have two investigations going on at the same time, which of course takes up much time and many resources. We'll spend most of our time covering the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Wyoming Fair Employment Practices Act of 1965. You'll notice there are many similarities between these two acts. For example, Title VII prohibits discrimination based upon an individual's race, color, sex, religion, and national origin. The Wyoming Fair Employment Practices Act prohibits discrimination based on many similar factors. However, it has been amended to include age and disability. Now, this also includes retaliation. As we covered earlier, anyone that participates in an investigation on some sort of complaint, if they are retaliated against, or the individual who reports the possible discrimination, if they are retaliated against, that is the same as violating the actual acts themselves. Under the Wyoming Fair Employment Practices Act of 1965, an allegation must be made or a complaint must be made within 6 months of the most recent discriminatory act. But under the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is federal coverage, it requires the most recent discriminatory act to have taken place within the last 300 days. Now, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 also covers sexual harassment, simply because you're treating someone differently or discriminating against them because of their gender. The Wyoming Fair Employment Practices Act and also the Governor's Executive Order 2000-4 prohibits sexual harassment. There are two basic types of sexual harassment. The first type is quid pro quo, which means this for that. This is usually when a supervisor says, if you provide certain sexual behaviors, I will give you a promotion or a raise or some sort of favorable environment. It could also mean, if you don't do this for me, I'll withhold certain benefits or favors. Then we also have the hostile work environment, sexual harassment. This one is a little bit more complicated because a hostile work environment is an environment at the workplace which significantly and adversely affects an employee because of his or her sex. These are, for example, unwelcome sexual advances or conduct. In other words, repeated advances. If someone makes an advance once and is rejected and they do not continue that behavior, it's probably not a hostile work environment. However, if it continues, it would be considered a possible hostile work environment. It also includes taunts, touching, pictures, jokes, or other harassing words or action. Notice how this differs from the quid pro quo. It could be simply an environment where there are a lot of sexual overtones. It could be also conduct that is acceptable to one employee and it may be offensive to another employee. Just because one employee finds certain behavior acceptable does not mean that other employees may find it also acceptable. So you need to be aware of what the employees and how they are behaving and what one employee might be uncomfortable with. If someone were to tell an inappropriate joke, and members of your work crew laugh at it, but you have one employee that is not laughing, usually silence is a sign of disapproval and should be investigated. Now, unless the conduct is severe, a single comment or incident would not be sufficient to create a hostile work environment. Usually when I give a presentation like this, I'll have somebody come up and say, I believe I'm in a hostile work environment. My first question is, why do you think you're in a hostile work environment? Well, sometimes the answer is, well, my boss is just downright mean and nasty to me. Unfortunately, this would not qualify as a hostile work environment, simply because it does not fall under one of the protected categories that we talked about earlier. It is not a harassment on a basis of gender. It must be harassment based on one of these other factors that we talked about. Now, because they are not protected, the employee is not protected under the Act, does not mean the behavior is not acceptable. For example, we do have the Governor's Executive Order on workplace violence. We also have the Governor's Executive Order on the Code of Ethics, which clearly states that we will need to treat our fellow employees and members of the public in a courteous manner. Now, sexual harassment may be any unwelcome or sexual advance, but it should be some sort of repeated or pattern before it can be considered sexual harassment, unless it's particularly egregious. Conduct on the job that creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment would also fall under sexual harassment. And then finally, any conduct of a sexual nature that makes an employee feel uncomfortable has the potential to be sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is also based on the impact. It's evaluated based on impact or effect, not the intent. So even though a harasser may not have intended to create an environment of sexual harassment, that is not important. What is important is the impact that it has on the work center. That means we need to be very cautious in our behavior when it comes to this area. If a coworker or subordinate is offended, it may become sexual harassment. And of course, anyone can be sexually harassed. The harasser may be the victim's supervisor, the manager, a coworker, a customer or vendor, or of the same sex. It is imperative to note that if a customer or vendor engages in sexually harassing behavior, that you treat that much as you would anyone else in your organization. In other words, you need to address the behavior and ensure that it stops. In the case of a customer that may engage in sexually harassing behavior, you can identify the behavior to the customer, and if they continue, it could mean simply asking them to leave and notifying that they are not welcome back into that section. Or it could be, in the case of a vendor, if they are engaging in this behavior, notifying them of the behavior and asking it to change. If they refuse to change their behavior, you would notify the company or the vendor's supervisors. If that still continues, you can make a complaint or simply discontinue service with that vendor. Finally, it's important to note that individuals of the same sex may sexually harass another person. Usually this occurs when one employee of the same sex makes an attack upon that other person's gender. If an employee is treating someone different based upon their sex or gender, they are probably engaging in some sort of sexual harassment. For example, if a man addresses another man and suggests that he is behaving in an effeminate manner, that could be sexual harassment because that person is attacking that other person's gender. So we must be very careful on how we address each other and make sure that we don't sexually harass this person and treat them differently based solely on their sex. There are other types of unlawful discrimination that fall into this area. They can also lead to a hostile work environment, such as making decisions based upon a person's race, color, religion, national origin. If you're making decisions based on one of these factors or multiple factors, you may be committing unlawful discrimination and creating a hostile work environment. You also may not use any of these protected categories as a basis for employment. If you're treating someone differently based upon all of these factors that we've discussed, then you're probably committing some sort of harassment that may fall into the hostile work environment that we discussed. Additionally, derogatory comments or slurs based on any of these factors that we discussed, they're prohibited under this act. And they're also a violation of the governor's executive order on anti-discrimination. Well, why should we care? Well, not only are we violating the individual's civil rights, but it can also lead to low morale or turnover. It's not uncommon for someone who is in an uncomfortable environment to avoid that environment. It can also increase the absenteeism, and then you lose productivity in return. Additionally, if there's a claim of harassment, there are going to be investigations that take place. These investigations can take time away from productivity. There are also legal fees and court costs that are often associated with these investigations or complaints. And the alleged harasser and supervisor who does nothing can be named individually in the lawsuit. So not only could someone sue the state for their civil rights being violated, you as a supervisor can be held accountable in a court of law. And finally, it can result in possible payment of lost wages to the employee.